So let's go ahead and create the repository that we need, and that repository is going to extend the JPA repository so that we can leverage the functions in there. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new package. Let's do package, and I'm going to do repository. In that repository, I need to create a user repository. So let's do user repository. And that's going to be an interface because this interface, we're gonna extend the JPA repository with it. So let's do extend, that's gonna be JPA repository. Now for JPA repository, we need to pass in two things. We need to pass in the object or the class that we want to manage. So that's gonna be our user class from our domain. And we also have to specify the type of the primary key. In our case, that was the actual, that was long. Okay. Now in there, I want to define two methods. The first one is going to be, it's going to return a user, and it's going to be find user by username. And this is going to take a string, which is going to be the username. So this is how you define method when you want them to leverage the JPA repository. So technically what I'm doing here is, hopefully you guys are a little bit familiar with JPA repository, but when you do find user, that means select user by username. It's gonna search and find the username where this username equals that username that's in the database. So it's technically gonna build a query from this, and JPA repository is smart enough to understand that and then translate it into a query and then query the database. So for this specific one, it's gonna be select user from whatever table from the user table where the actual username equals whatever username that we're gonna pass here, and then it's gonna return us an entire user. And the next one that I need is going to be the one for the email. So I can just copy this and then paste it down there, and then I just have to change this to email and change this to email as well. And it's also going to return a user. So I have find, oops, that has to be lower uppercase. So find user by email. We just pass in the email, and then it's going to return the user. So that's all we have to do here for now. At this point, we can go ahead and create an actual service, and that service will be able to call the user repository. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a new package, and that's going to be the service package. So I'm going to call it service. And in that service package, I'm going to go ahead and create a new class, and that's going to be the user service. Okay, this is the service that the controller is going to call, and then that service in return will call the repository that we just created here. And that repository, leveraging JPA, they will be able to access the database and then get the information that we want. And again, this is going to be an interface. And for right now, I'm not going to put anything here just yet. We'll come back to this, but let me create an implementation for this. So let's do another package, and I'm just going to call it MPL, which stands for implementation. You can call this something else, something more creative. And then in here, I'm going to create the implementation of this user service. So I'm going to do user service implementation. Okay, and that's going to be a class this time because it's implementing this interface. So now that we have this implementation, we need to implement the user service. Okay, so here we're going to do user service. Okay, so now, and also we have to implement the other method that Spring Security needs to leverage the security aspect of getting the user, and then check to see if the user provided the good credential. And for this one, it's going to be the user details service. Okay, so we have to also implement this this actual interface, and then we can actually override this method right here. This is the method that gets called whenever Spring Security is trying to check the authentication of a user. So Spring Security will call this method inside this interface to find the actual user. So let's go back here and then implement this method. And that's the only one we have to implement since we don't have anything in there yet. So it's saying, hey, from all the implementation that you're doing for these two interfaces. From this one, you get this class. So we need to implement this specific method, which is the one that's going to be called whenever the user is going to log in. So instead of string, we're going to change this to username, because obviously it's searching, loading a user by that username, and if it can't find it, it's gonna throw this user not found exception. So just to recap before I actually dive into implementing, writing out this method, the first thing you have to understand is we have a database, right? And all of our users are gonna be stored in that database. So when a user comes to log into our application, at some time before, they had to create an account with us, which means we would have a record of that user in the database. So when they come in to log in, they're going to provide us their username and their password. And Spring Security needs to go ahead and find that user in the database. And if you can't find it, it's going to throw this exception. So this is what this method is doing. But we need to have a way to access the database, which means we would have to write some queries, which is why in the repository folder here, we created this user repository. Now, this user repository, it's extending the JPA repository. The JPA repository has method that you can use to query a database, which is those method here. If you guys know how to write those JPA methods, you know, when you have to define find, you know that. So select query user, which means it's going to return a user, because that's what you pass in here as the actual class that you want to return. So this is going to do the data access for us. And then once the information is returned, it's going to be passed to Spring Security. So at this point right now, what we're doing is we're just trying to tell this service, which needs to get the user, how we're going to get the user here. So once this gets executed, it's going to try to find the user. Once the user logs in, it's going to try to find the user using the username. So we have to tell it what happens then if it can't find the user or whatever. So we have to implement this method right here. So what we have to do now, we just have to say you're going to try to find the user, and this is going to come from our domain. And let's just call it user. And that user, to find it, you just have to go to use the repository and then query the user by that username. So which means we have to bring in the actual repository. So let's do user repository, and let's just call it user repository. Okay, so now we have the user repository here. We have to use annotation on that, but I'm going to do that in a second. So once we have the repository, we can say, hey, we're going to call this method in the repository and then pass in the username of the user. So we're telling it where to go find the user, which is in our database, in this case using the user repository, find by username method, which JPA is going to take and then transform it into a query, which is going to be a select query, because we're using the find user by username, which is like convention. And you guys can do a little bit of research on that, but that's like a little bit outside of the scope of the project. So I don't want to go into all the details of this, but technically what we're saying here is go fetch me a user by that username. So once that happens, we have to check to make sure that the user is not null. So we can say if the user is null, right? We already know what's going to happen. Then we have to throw this exception because we didn't find the user. So we can do, if that happens, then we're going to just throw this exception. So let's do throw new this exception, and then here we can pass a simple message. So user by user not found by username, and then we can pass in the username here. Okay, username. Okay, just so we have something to throw. Okay, so we'll pass in this username and say, hey, we didn't find any user by that username. Actually, let me see if I can have a logger here, because if we have a logger, then everything is a lot easier. We can just log you know, all the events that happen whenever we need to log them. So let's do private. That's gonna be logger, and that's coming from SLFJ4. I think it's something logger for Java, which is the SLF4J, and we want that. Let's call it logger, and this is, we need a logger for this class right here, which is the user service implementation. So all we can do is we can call the logger factory. So logger factory from the same class, and then we can call get logger, and then here we just have to pass the class name. So we can just get get class, which is coming from the object. Since every class is an object, then we can call this class, which is going to return this actual class name for us. So this is going to be something like this. So instead of this, it's like we do this, user server implementation dot class. Okay, so instead of doing that, we can just call the very convenient method that we know, which is get class. Okay, that's just the same thing. So we can take this logger and then come down here before we throw the error. We can see logger dot error, since that's an error, and then we can pass in the same string. So I'm just gonna go ahead and copy this and paste it in here. That way we can just see it on the console what happens. Otherwise, right, if we actually find someone, what we're gonna do is we're gonna proceed with all the details of our logic and then return a user detail, which is what this is returning. I mean, make some room here so you can see this is returning a user detail. So we have to return that, and if we find it. And if you remember, when we build this application in the beginning, we define a user principal. So if we go back to the main, go to user principal, you can see the user principal implements the user detail, which means we can return a user principal by just passing, creating a user principal by just passing the constructor. And since it implements the user details, then we will be returning a user details here. So you can see how all the work that we did in the beginning is not connecting. So let's go back to the implementation. So now that we know that we have a user, we can continue writing the logic to return the user details. So what we have to do now is to call the user, and then we're gonna set some information, because at this point we know that the user is successfully authenticated because the username and the password that they provided, they're correct. So what I want to do is to set the login date display, right? So the login date display is going to be the user that, and then we need to get the last login date. Okay, so get the last login date. So once we have that, then we can set the last login date. So we can do user.set last login date, which is right now because they just log in. And then we can do new date. Okay, so you can see how this is all making sense now. So set the last login date display, which is the date that we're gonna display. We're just gonna get the last login, which is the last time they logged in before this execution that we're currently talking about. And then once we get that last time that they logged in for the display, we set the last time they log in, which is right now, which is why we just pass in a new date. So at this point, once we have set those information on the user, we can go ahead and then save the user. So we can do user repository and then call save, and then here we just pass the user. Now we didn't create this save method, it's already defined in JPA. Since we did this right here, we say extend JPA repository, we pass in the user, then all of those methods are available for us by default. So this is why if we actually go in there, you can see it's coming from CRUD repository, which in turn extend the actual repository, and I think this also extend the JPA repository. So this is the method that we're using. It's coming from CRUD repository. So once we save the user, because we need to save this information before we return the user or before we do anything with it, because we want this information, the last login displayed it and the last login date, we want this information to be current. Okay, so we have to save the user at this point. Now we can create our user principal so that we can return it. So let's do user principal coming from our domain, and let's just call it user principal. And in this case, we're just gonna create a new one, new user principal, and then we pass in the user. That way we created the user principal here, and this user principal, which we created in the beginning of the course, implements the user detail. So that means that we can return this user principal as a user details. Okay, so here before we return it, I just want to log some information. So let's call our logger that, in this case it's information, because it's not an error, everything is fine. I'm just passing in information. So we can say returning found user from returning found user, let's say by username, and we can put a the username in there, and then here we can pass in the username again, username, like this, and then we can then return this actual user. So we don't need this, and here we're gonna put our return statement, and then we can just return this user principal like this. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Again, we're doing something that's very simple, and I hope you guys have a little bit of experience with at least JPA, because you know, a lot of this is JPA with Spring Security. I'm also assuming that you have a very good knowledge of Spring Security. You're just here to actually get the gist of, you know, just using Spring Security with JWT, which is like a big thing right now with all the APIs going on. But that's what we're doing here. Now let's go ahead and just wire this repository, because it's not wired. So I'm gonna create a constructor, and I want to just get the constructor for this. Click OK. So now we can put auto wire on this, just to auto wire the actual bean. Okay, so we pass in the repository, and then we set this repository that we were using down there to the actual repository that gets created by when the bean is created. And then now we have to actually define this as a service. So let's do at service, because this is the actual service. So service, and we also gonna do transactional. I'm gonna tell you what that means in a minute. So transactional, and let's just give it a qualifier, just so we can give it a unique name. A qualifier is just a name for the actual bit. So qualifier, let's just call it user detail service. So I'm just gonna copy this and pass it in here. So the qualifier is just a name for that specific bean that's implementing all of these interfaces. And transactional is just to manage propagation whenever you're dealing with one transaction. And service just means that this class is a service. So that's what we have to do here for now. We probably will have to add a few more lines of code on this. Probably have to clean it up a little bit, but for now that should do. And then we can use this whenever we're creating the actual security configuration, because we can tell the security configuration how to go find our user when we pass in the username.